Ayin Gimel base 73b. It's a little bit cold today. Okay. I guess let's begin with a little bit of background. I guess yesterday we spoke a lot about hakosha. Hakosha is you have a contradicting testimony. Basically, one set of witnesses says yes, the other one says no. For example, Reuven killed Shimon, and they say no, Shimon's still alive. We saw him after we saw the guy who was murdered, the dead body. We saw him alive after the fact, so clearly he couldn't have been murdered. That is an example of Eidei HaKosha. They're contradicting the first witnesses. And the general scenario in that, the general halacha in that scenario is that we don't trust either of them. They're both suspect. Now there's a question here, which is basically the question of today, which is statement of Rava. Rava argues hakosha trilas hazama. So we spoke about hazama. Hazama yesterday. Hazama, if you remember, was when two witnesses testified that the witnesses are liars by the fact that they could not testify. They were not able to provide the testimony that they claimed to be able that they're claiming because they were in a different location at the time. That makes them Eidei Hazama, that makes them liars, and they get punished by we do to them what they wanted to do to somebody else. The question now, Rava, the statement that Rava proposes is that hakosha tchilas hazama. Okay, so now let's explain this. Let's say, for example, you have two people testify that Reuven kills Shimon. And then another two witnesses that say, no, it wasn't Reuven that killed Shimon, it was Yehudah that killed Shimon. So let's say, for example, the court has already ruled on the matter. They've already ruled that the halacha is that Reuven has to be killed. Reuven will be executed for killing Shimon. Now we have a second set of witnesses claiming it wasn't Reuven, it was Yehudah. So what do? We don't kill Reuven. Because we don't know if he was the murderer. We don't know what to do. Then afterwards, two witnesses come in and say it wasn't, and say that those that testify that Reuven killed Shimon, they could not have testified Reuven killed Shimon because they were in a different location at the time. If that's the case, so they planned on killing Shimon. The court ruled that they planned on killing Reuven, the murderer. The court actually ruled in their favor that we would have killed Reuven if not for the fact that two other witnesses came and contradicted them. Okay, therefore, Rava says, even though ultimately speaking, we did not kill them because there was a contradicting testimony, but because contradicting the witnesses is the first step to determining that they're liars, therefore, we do consider them to the word, by the way, of zamam is planning. That's what the word means. Zama means they were planning. So we consider them zomimim. They were planners. They planned on killing Reuven, even though their plans were thwarted twice. First by the witnesses of hakosha, contradiction, then by the witnesses of hazama, they were liars. It doesn't make a difference. You can still kill them because ultimately speaking, they did plan on killing Reuven. They were somewhat successful in their plan because the court did order Reuven to get the death penalty. Ultimately speaking, they weren't successful because it was contradicting, but it doesn't make a difference. Even if they were first contradicting testimony, ultimately speaking, they were huzam, they were turned into liars, and therefore you can kill them. And today we sort of go back and forth, first among a major Bryce, and then we go back to our parak, Meruba. So Amar Rava, Edim shehokchushu ul'b'sayf huzmu. You have testimony that was contradicted, and then it was huzam, and then it turns out the witnesses are liars. Neharogan, the witnesses are killed. In an instance, for example, where they were attempting to kill somebody. So they wanted to kill a murderer, should we say an alleged murderer, and first they were contradicted, so they didn't kill the murderer, and then they were huzam, they were determined to be liars. Neharagan, they're still killed. The hakchosha tchilas hazama, contradiction is the first stage in determining that the witnesses are liars. Okay, it hasn't concluded yet. We haven't fully determined that they're liars. So Amar Rava says, Mina Amin Allah. How do I know this? The Tanya we learned. Okay, so we're familiar with the law that if somebody takes out an organ, there's I can't remember the exact number. I think it's 24 Rashi Ivarim. It's more than that. If a person knocks an organ, now an organ is said in the loosest possible sense. It can be an eye, but it could also be a tooth of his slave, his Eved Kanani slave. The slave goes out free. Okay, so we have an interesting story here. The Bryce is not so clear. We'll explain it in a moment. The Bryce says, Me'idani, Me'idanu, we testified that this person, he blinded his slave at least in one eye, and then he knocked out his tooth. Shari Harav Aimerkain, the master admits to the fact. And then it turns out they're Eidim Zaymun. They pay the value of an eye to the slave. Okay, there's something obviously missing in the story. Page position on Ayin Gimel Beis 73b. A little more than halfway down. First word on the line is Hechidami. If the story is as is, in other words, two people testified that, let's say the master first he knocked out an eye, then he knocked out a tooth. And they pay the value of a tooth to the master. So 1 second, that story makes no sense. Why? One second. So the Gemara says, so you pay the value of the eye to the slave. But so the Gemara asks, there's another problem here. If it turns out they were liars, it's not just that you pay an eye, you should have to pay the entire value of a slave. In other words, your testimony is he knocked out an eye, then he knocked out a tooth. And the master agrees with them, which sounds a little bit odd if you're wondering. We'll get to that in a moment, we'll explain. But the first problem here is, so they pay the value of the eye to the master. Why aren't they paying the value of a slave to the master? They wanted to get the slave free. Turns out the whole story was baloney. So why is the slave going free? What they owe the master a new slave. They planned on freeing his slave. They were unsuccessful, so they pay what they planned on doing. Okay, 1 second. Okay, and Boston Bafka Lecheres Me'ene Kavoy L'Shlumilei. Okay, yeah, and moreover, if he knocked out a tooth, he knocked out an eye first and then a tooth. So what happens? Let's say, for example, this happens in practically. A master knocks out a slave's eye and then knocks out his tooth. So he owes him the value of a tooth. In other words, the eye, because he took out his eye, so the slave goes free. Now the slave is a free man and you took out his tooth, you owe him a payment for a tooth. So why are you paying him here the value of an eye? You should be paying the value of a tooth. Okay. Why exactly is the master agreeing with the witnesses here? That sounds a little interesting. I'm sorry. You have to pay the entire value of the slave, which is yes. Why exactly is the master supporting this version of the story? Elalav, it must be. Okay, so the story is a little more complicated than that. What happened? Two witnesses came. They say he knocked out. The first two witnesses say he knocked out a tooth, then he knocked out an eye. So the master has to give him the value of an eye. V'asu betray mitziai, and then another two witnesses came. V'amri, they say, Einai v'hado shinai. First is eye, then a tooth. They only have to give him a tooth. And over here you have the first witnesses and the second witness is contradicting. They're contradicting each other on the order of how things happened. Was it that he first knocked out an eye, then a tooth, or a tooth and then an eye? The second item he has to pay for in damages. The master is supporting the second witnesses. The second set of witnesses, they're claiming that first an eye, then a tooth. The master prefers that story because obviously, as you can imagine, a tooth is a much cheaper replacement than an eye. Ukatani, and the story is V'nimtzu Zaymim. What happened was the middle witnesses turned out to be liars. Mishamad me'ayin levet. They pay the value of an eye to the slave. Why? Because initially the guy was saying tooth then eye, meaning the eye payment would be made to the slave. They're saying no, it was eye then tooth. Now both of them are agreeing the slave goes out free, but the second set of witnesses are trying to exempt the master from paying the slave for an eye, and therefore they pay the slave for that eye. Shmami, now we see from here that the contradiction is the beginning of the hazama, of determining that they're liars. 1 second. Yeah. You see in this scenario, first they were First they contradicted the claim of the first ones. Then they were huzam. Then they were determined to be liars. So that they still have to pay because we still acted they still came to testify with a plan to deduct payments from the slave. And even though they were contradicted, so we don't know what to do, but it doesn't change the fact that there was a plan here. And if afterwards, even though they were contradicted, they can still even though they were contradicted, we can still force the witnesses we can still falsify their testimony if they had hazama afterwards. So Amar Abaya says no proof. Loi, not necessarily. The afchinu va'azminu. It could be that the scenario was where there was no three sets of witnesses. What happened was, 1 second. According to Abaya, there were only two sets of witnesses. The first one says first a tooth, then an eye. The second one says you could not have seen the story because you were with us somewhere else. But we did see the story, and it was actually the opposite. First an eye, then a tooth. 1 second. I'm sorry, the opposite. I'm sorry. 1 second. The original. Hold on. Okay, yeah, it would be the opposite. 1 second. The first set of witnesses say a tooth, then an eye. They're trying to get. 1 second. No. I had it right before. No. It was an eye and then a tooth, and they're mazim. They undermine the testimony and they say no. It was a tooth, then an eye. So actually, what the first witnesses tried to do was to detract from the slave the payment of an eye, because they said the tooth happened second, and actually what happened was the eye happened second. Okay, in this case, there are two sets of witnesses, but there's no contradiction because they were mazim them. They determined that they were liars immediately. Only afterwards they testified that actually the story happened in the other direction. Okay, mimai. How do we know this? Mida seifa from the end of the brayso. Mida seifa b'meipach v'azama reishnami b'meipach v'azama. Okay, Abaya proves this that the story is b'meipach v'azama, meaning they said you're liars, and the story happened the opposite. That's proven from the end of the brayso. Diktani seifa, because the brayso concludes by saying the following story: Mi'idono es ishplaining shehipil as shein avdei. We testify about such a person that he knocked out his slave's tooth. V'simas eina, and then he knocked out his eye. So tooth, and then eye. Shara evet omer kain, because the slave supports that opinion, right? Obviously, the slave wants that because the slave would like to get money for his eye. If his tooth is knocked out first, he gets payment for his eye. V'nim tzayim, turns out they were liars. Meshamad me'ayin l'rav, they pay the value of an eye to the master. Obviously, they wanted the master to have to pay for an eye. What's the scenario? If the second set of witnesses, the Eidei Hazama, that determined the first set were liars, if they don't specify that the slave goes free regardless, so you don't just pay the value of an eye to the master, you pay the entire value of a slave. In other words, the first set of witnesses wanted to free the slave. The second set of witnesses are saying the first ones are liars. In effect, they planned on freeing a slave that didn't deserve to be freed. They should pay the entire value of the slave to the master. Elapshita, it's obvious. The kamodu kula b'chavola. They agree that the slave was damaged. However, it's a scenario where they flipped the story and they were mazing them. Meaning, they said, first of all, you can't testify about the story because you weren't there at the time. And second of all, the story did actually happen, but it happened in the reverse order. First, his eye got knocked out, then his tooth got knocked out. Okay, so the first witnesses testified on Monday. The guy knocked out his tooth, then knocked out his eye. If they say it happened on Tuesday, but not on Monday, then actually at the time they were testifying, they wanted the guy to go. They wanted to free the entire slave. That was their plan. They should have to pay a whole slave. Because even according to the second testimony, the guy gets freed only the next day, not at the time that they were testifying, the previous day, Monday. Okay, okay, so it must be that they're testifying. It didn't hit the story. The witnesses that are mazim, that are determining the first set of witnesses are liars. They're saying the story happened, but it happened on Sunday. Okay, so the Gemara says, okay, there's another interesting catch here, which is that losing a slave because you knocked out his tooth is a penalty. And therefore, if the master admits to his crime, the slave does not go out free. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Even if they say the story happened earlier, but ultimately speaking, he wasn't yet freed. He was freed because of the second set of witnesses. I'm sorry, because of the first set of witnesses. One second. Yeah, because until Monday, until Tuesday, let's say, these witnesses, that the first witnesses that testify that the event happened on Monday, they tried to free a slave. At that point, nobody had testified. The master had the story happened on Sunday. So they, ultimately speaking, they were trying to free the slave entirely. If that's the case, then they should still be liable for a full slave. So the Gemara says, the Gemara says, okay, so what happened was actually much more nuanced. What happened was there was a debate here of exactly what happened. In other words, in some faraway town, Master Ruvain knocked out a tooth and blinded in one eye the slave, Kolam Chamar. Okay, now, at the time, in this faraway place, there was a court case, and it was determined that Chamar was freed, and the master had to pay. The first set of witnesses say it happened on Sunday, and it was his tooth that was knocked out, then it was his eye. And the second set of witnesses say the story that you claim happened in that court actually happened earlier. It happened a week earlier, and it was the opposite version. It was first the tooth, then the eye. Oh, and by the way, you weren't in that court anyway when you claimed you were there, because we were with you and we were on vacation together. Okay, all of this is a nice way of saying that there is no proof of Hakosha Tchilas Hazama, because if you only have one contradicting testimony, which is both Hazama and Hakosha, Hazama meaning first they're declaring the testimony of the first set of witnesses were liars, and second of all, that the event actually did happen, but it happened in a different order. There's no proof to the concept of Hakosha Tchilas Hazama. The concept of Hakosha Tchilas Hazama is where you have three sets of witnesses. Witnesses one are contradicted by witnesses two, and then a third set is Mazim witness one. And the question is, because you were already contradicted, do you get the penalty or not? And Rava says yes. And Abaya basically says to Rava, sorry, but there's no proof. Together? Okay, 1 second. Amalei Ravacha Breder Ravika Ravashi. So Ravacha, the son of Ravika, says to Ravashi, Duki de Rava Mehecha. Okay, so Abaya basically just eviscerated Rava's argument. Where did Rava get it from? If Rava got it from the first half of the brisa, the story where, again, there were three sets of witnesses. The first one said tooth, then eye. The second one said eye, then tooth. The second witnesses are contradictory. The third witnesses were mazim the second ones. So mika miskak se'ilam eresha. Resha mika miskakshim etziyoi. Even the ilam mitzazim sadusi kavasai pikaimel. Dina kavasai paskin. Diyesh b'chlam asai amana. Hekla chamoyhu dika miskakshi mitziyoi lo miskakshi midi. Okay, so Ravacha here has a very interesting point. He says Rava, let's say Rava learns the first scenario that there were three sets of witnesses. It still doesn't prove Rava's point. Why? Let's explain. What happened in that scenario? Witnesses number two were both contradicted and later determined to be liars. Witnesses number one said tooth, then eye. So what does that mean? Slave is freed because of the tooth. Then the master pays the eye. Now, how much does an eye cost? Let's say it's $50,000. What's a tooth worth? I don't know, $3,000, $5,000, small amount of money. Let's say it's $5,000. So it's 10 times the value. Now, second set of witnesses comes in and they say like this. The story happened, but first it was the eye, then it was the tooth. So how much does the master owe the slave now? $5,000. Okay, so now we have contradiction. How much? Everybody agrees on the basic facts. The slave is freed. Everyone's in agreement. Everyone's also in agreement the master owes the slave something. The only question is how much. One group says he owes $50,000. The other group says $5,000. So now guess what? Within $50,000 is also $5,000. Right? So the second set of witnesses that say eye then tooth, actually we end up listening to them. Because the tooth is $5,000. So fine, so the slave goes free with the $5,000 payment. So even though they're contradicted, but we're actually listening to them. We're giving him the $5,000. Because it's a common denominator. Everyone agrees that at least $5,000 is owed. So if that's the case, there's no proof that Hakosha Tchilas Hazama, because typically Hakosha Tchilas Hazama is there's a stalemate, right? There's a deadlock. Reuven testify again. Two witnesses testify. Group one says Reuven killed Shimon. The court says, okay, Reuven's guilty. Reuven's getting capital punishment. The second set of witnesses comes running in. They say, no, it wasn't Reuven, it was Yehudah. Now what do? Nothing. We don't know what to do. We can't kill Reuven. We can't kill Yehudah. So what's the value of the testimony of the first group? Zero. And now group number three comes in and says, group number one, you're liars. Rava says, we killed group number one. And that's a huge chiddush, because what was group number one effectiveness? Zero. Because ultimately speaking, we were deadlocked. But in our scenario, group number two, which was immediately contradicted, they were the contradicting testimony, we actually listened to them. So that's not a good example of Hakosha Tchilas Hazama. Because that's an example where we listened to the Eidei HaKosha, not where we deadlocked and couldn't do anything. We were paralyzed by the contradiction. Okay, I hope it's clear to everyone on Zoom. If it's not clear, feel free to interrupt. Okay, Amr Leis, he says you're right. The first part of the brisa doesn't work. Rava Savar Midi Reisha B'Shleisha Kitais Seifa Nam B'Shleisha Daik Mi Seifa. Okay, just like the first scenario in the brisa was 3 sets of witnesses. Remember, the first one says tooth then eye. The second one says eye then tooth. Right, the second one makes a smaller payment, and the third one says the second group, you're liars. Daik Mi Seifa. 3 going to also be Treva Amr Hippel Shina V'Sima Seinai. Group number 1 walks in, same story. They say tooth, then eye. Upaskinu l'dina apumayu. So the court says, okay. They tell the master, slave is freed, you got to pay for an eye, $50,000. They say, no. Eye, then tooth. What happens? The court says, okay, $45,000 goes back to the owner. You only pay $5,000. That's the common denominator. Okay. And then it turns out the first group were lying. They pay $45,000 to the master. So now, what happens? Okay, again, group number 1 says tooth then eye. The court says, okay, tooth then eye, slave free, $50,000 payment. Then group number 2 comes in. They say, no. Eye, then tooth. So the court says, okay, slave, give back $45,000. The master does not have to pay $45,000. He only has to pay $5,000 for the tooth. That's the common denominator. And then a third set comes in and says, first set of witnesses are liars. They tried making the master pay $50,000. They were not successful. They were deadlocked on 45 of the 1,000. Effectively, they were deadlocked on their claim of eye. And yet a second set of witnesses comes in, a third, whatever, in this case, the third set of witnesses comes in, says they're liars, they pay $45,000 to the master because they tried making him pay an additional $45,000. So you see that there was deadlock on their claim, and yet we still say that they have to pay. Clearly, that's because hakosha tchilas hazama, that you could be mazim after hakosha happens. Together? Okay. Abaye says no. Bishlam Ratio loisagi below sholosh kitas. Shektani harav imerkain. El seif alam li sholosh kitas. Or eved imerkain eved kolduhu meimer omar denichale denefik lecheres. The first scenario in the Mishnah is clearly talking about contradicting witnesses, which is why the master is supporting one of the witnesses. If there weren't contradicting witnesses, the master wouldn't be supporting any witness, right? There must be contradictory witnesses. However, in the second scenario, the slave would rather go free with a wound, so he'd rather support the witnesses in any which way, right? Than not be freed at all. So even though they're saying he's wounded and he gets payment, or he gets a small payment or big payment, whatever it is, but he would support their testimony because he wants to be freed. Okay, Maskler of Zera asks Ema Seifa. Simas Einai. He knocked out a tooth. An eye. Nepuk be'enai. Hippel ashinai. Nepuk b'shinai. If he knocked out a tooth, he goes out with a tooth. He goes out because of that. Simas Einai ve'hippel ashinai. Nepuk be'enai v'shinai. So Rav Zera says that if Rav Zera brings the end of the brisa, which says if he loses a tooth and an eye, he goes out because of both of them. So this implies that actually there would be no financial payment at all. The master would be exempt both for the eye and for the tooth, no matter which came first. So Abaye was not, summarily rejects his argument. Abaye says no. It doesn't mean that he leaves because that he doesn't get paid for both of them. The verse clearly says you leave the slavery for an eye or a tooth. For an eye, but not for an eye and a tooth. For a tooth, but not for a tooth and an eye. Meaning, if the guy's tooth is knocked out, he's free. Then you have to pay for his eye. If his eye is knocked out, he's free. Then you have to pay for his tooth. You only have to make one payment. The slave leaves because of a single event. Afterwards, it becomes a financial payment. Okay. And now we get back to Masechta Bava Kamma, and we go back to Meruba. And now we're going to try to finish this Gemara from our parak. Amr of Idi Baravin. Afanana mitnina. I can prove it to you from our Mishnah. Go back to our Mishnah. What do we see? Ganav al pishnayim. He stole. There were two witnesses to testify that the guy stole an animal and then slaughters it. Sold or slaughtered. Vinim turns out they're liars. What's the rule? Mishal and loyasakol. They have to pay. Remember, so a guy testifies, a group of people testify, Reuven stole from Shimon. How much does Reuven have to pay? 2 payments. Principal, what we call Karen, and then Chaimish. I'm sorry. It's not true. It's not true or Kach. It's Kefil. It's Karen and Kefil. That's payments 1 and 2. Then he stole or slaughtered either the ox or let's say the ox. Okay, so then he has to pay an additional 3 animals, 3, 4, and 5. These people said he stole. That means 1 and 2. Then he slaughtered it, 3, 4, 5. Then they're liars. All 5. They got to pay all 5. Okay, my love, what's the story? First they said he stole. Then they said he slaughtered it. Okay, what happened? What happens next? They were liars about the robbery. Hold on a second. If they were liars about the robbery, then what happened? The slaughtering could never have happened. Or even if it did happen, it's not significant, because if you don't sleal the animal first, the slaughtering doesn't make you make 3 payments. So now their second testimony is actually hakasha. It's contradicted. Because 1 second. Their testimony about slaughter is now contradicted. And yet they still pay 5 animals, because the second half of the testimony that they slaughter the animal, is deadlocked. You can't do anything with that testimony, because you don't have the original testimony that they're robbers in the first place, because they were liars when they said he was a robber. So now we're deadlocked on the second set of testimony, but yet when we're mazamit, when we falsify it, it does make a difference. Despite the fact that we're deadlocked on the second testimony, they'll still have to pay 5, because that was their original intention. Clearly, this supports the opinion of Rava that says, meaning even though you're contradicted, you're deadlocked on your testimony, because that was your intention, that was what you planned on doing. If the testimony is falsified after or it's contradicted, you would still pay for what you planned on doing. So the Gemara says, Amri, the Gemara rejects it. We can simply answer, it could be a scenario where actually the hazama happened on the slaughter first and then on the robbery. So first you pay 3 and then you pay 2, and it's not difficult. There's no support to the claim of Rava. Okay, let's wrap it up now. This debate is a machlekes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yechon. Very interesting machlekes. Chad amar neharagan v'chad amar ein neharagan. One says that they're killed, the other says there isn't killed. Going back to what's the scenario? Again, Reuven killed. Group 1 says Reuven kills Shimon. Group 2 says no, it was Yehudah that killed Shimon. We'll soon see. There's even a better way to do this, but we'll get to it. Get to it at the end of the Gemara. Very, very, very smart way to do this. Okay, for now, Group 1 says Reuven killed Shimon. Group 2 says it was Yehudah that killed Shimon. Okay, so Group 1. They came to court. They got a court ruling that Reuven's a murderer. He's going to be killed. And then Group 2 runs into court. They say no, it was Yehudah. So the court immediately stops the death penalty proceedings, and there's nothing they can do. And then afterwards, the third set comes in and says the first set, Group 1, they're liars. What's the rule? Group 1 is killed, even though their testimony was deadlocked. We are on now 74b, and we're before the Mishnah, probably about 12 lines before the Mishnah. First word on the line is Dir Rabbi Elazar, Daled Reish Aleph, with the 2 lines there in the middle. Let's prove from the fact that Rabbi Elazar says they're not killed. Rabbi Elazar says Hakasha lav tchilas hazama, meaning because you were deadlocked on your testimony and you couldn't actually kill him, therefore you don't get killed. If it turns out you were that Group 1 was liars, Group 1 would not be killed. The Amar Elazar, Edim shehukshu benefesh loikin. if there's a contradiction among the test, this, by the way, does not make sense. We'll explain in a moment. There's a contradiction among the testimony. In other words, the witness's testimony is contradicted. We give them malchus. We whip them. Hold on. If the Isak that Rabbi Yehudah and the Herogin, if Rabbi Yehudah says that Choshet Chilas Azama, am I liken Havay Lav Shnit Lazarus Mises Bezin, Kol Lav Shnit Lazarus Mises Bezin, and liken Olaf. Okay, let's explain this. Same story. Okay, Ruvain. We'll like to modify the story a little bit. Ruvain said, group one comes in and says Ruvain kills Shimon. Okay, then it's proven that it could not have happened, but there's no Edi Hazama. Remember, Edi Hazama is very specific. Edi Hazama says that group one could not have been there at the time. We don't have that. We just have other circumstantial evidence. We have tire marks in the ground or something, some other DNA markers, and we can prove that it wasn't Ruvain. So what do we do to group one? We whip them. Hold on 1 second here. If Hakoshet Chilas Hazama, then we could always undermine group one with Edi Hazama. If we get Edi Hazama, what happens to group one? They get killed. So actually, group one's action, meaning the false testimony, could result in them being killed. And because of that, it should exempt them from Malchus. This is a similar idea to Kollel b'derab minei. Because their action is something that could have the culpability of death, capital punishment. Therefore, we would not give them lashes. So clearly, Rabbi Elazar does not hold a lav shma min. Rabbi Elazar the Amar Eina. Rabbi Elazar holds that kosher lav tchilas azalma, and they would not be killed to stayim. That's a proof. So now the Gemara presumes. How do we know that their testimony was contradicted? Presumably, there was another set of witnesses. The Gemara says, train in it. My cause the son was a hani, smay hani. So you have two contradicting witnesses. One says that Reuven killed Shimon. The other says Yehudah killed Shimon. So why does group one get Malchus? It's contradiction. We don't know what to do. We're deadlocked. The Gemara says, no. The reason how we know that group one are liars, the murdered kid, Shimon walks into court. Shimon was allegedly murdered. Reuven says that Shimon was murdered by Reuven. I'm sorry. Group one says that Reuven murdered Shimon. Right? So the court was about to kill Reuven. And then it turns out Shimon walks into court. So clearly, group one are liars. Very clearly. So now we know that they're liars, so that we give them Malchus. We give them Malchus for lying, being contradicted by the evidence. But ultimately speaking, we don't have Hazama. This is, by the way, one of the interesting features, which is that you would need specifically Edi Hazama. Now, obviously, Reuven couldn't have killed Shimon if Shimon's alive, right? But you would still, what was that? But you still would not kill the witnesses for lying. It's only with Edi Hazama that you kill them. This is more the subject of both Sanhedrin and Makkas, but it is the case that this is the fact. So in this case, Rabbi Elazar says because Hakosha lav tchilas hazama, meaning this testimony obviously is useless because Shimon's still alive. Therefore, the group one is eligible for lashes for clearly lying, and indeed we give them lashes. But if Edi Hazama came at a later point and determined that they were liars, falsified their testimony, they would not get the penalty of death. Have a great day, and I hope that the ride was enjoyable. One long ride today.